In this section, I'm going to teach you how to build reusable components in Angular. So by the end of this section, you'll be able to pass data to your components, raise custom events from your components, apply styles to your components, and you will also learn about shadow DOM and view encapsulation in Angular components. So there's a lot to cover. Now let's get started. So in the last section, you learned about property and event binding. We use property binding with the square bracket syntax to bind properties of DOM objects to fields or properties in our host component. That is the component that is using that DOM object, in this case, this image object. Another way to think of this is that this source property is an input into this DOM object. We use this to supply data for this object, to supply some state. Now, similarly, we use event binding to respond to the events raised from a DOM object, in this case, the click event of a button. But this favorite component we implemented in the last section, it doesn't have any property and event binding. It's not very reusable. Ideally, I want to set the initial state of this favorite component using some object that we have in the host component. For example, here in app component, let's say we get a post object from the server. So let's go to app.component.ts. Okay, so here I want to define a post object. This post object has a title and also this isFavorite property, and I'm going to set this to true. Now for now, let's not worry about the complexity of getting this object from the server. Let's just imagine we have this object in memory. Now in the template for app component, we want to display this post, and if it's set as favorite, we want to render this favorite icon as a full star. So back in the template, here, unfortunately, we cannot use property binding to bind this isFavorite field of the favorite component to this post object that we have in this component, .isFavorite. This is not going to work. Let me show you. First, let me delete these two lines so we focus only on one thing. Now back in the browser, look at this error. Can't bind to isFavorite since it isn't a known property of favorite. So this property binding doesn't work. Even though in favorite component we have this field called isFavorite, and this is a public field. Because in Angular templates, in order for you to use property binding, you need to define that property or that field as an input property. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. So to make this favorite component more reusable, we want to add support for property and event binding. For example, in the future, we want to be notified whenever the user clicks on this favorite component. For example, we want this favorite component to raise a change event like this. And we want to be notified and call a method in the host component, in this case, app component. So onFavorite change. And inside this method, we can call the server or do something else. Once again, to add support for event binding, we need to define a special property in this favorite component that we refer to as an output property. In other words, in order to make a component more reusable, we want to add a bunch of input and output properties. We use input properties to pass input or state to a component. And we use output properties to raise events from these custom components. The combination of input and output properties for a component make up what we call the public API of that component. Public API, which stands for Application Programming Interface. So now our favorite component doesn't currently have a public API because it doesn't have any input or output properties. And in other words, we cannot use property and event binding here. So over the next few lectures, I'm going to show you how to add support for property and event binding to this favorite component and make it more reusable. So here in favorite component, we want to mark this field isFavorite as an input property So we can use it in property binding expressions, like here in app.component.html. Now there are two ways to mark this field as an input property. Here's the first approach. We need to import a decorator function here on the top from Angular/core library. This is called input. And then we can use this to annotate this field. So @ input, and we call it like a function, exactly like how we use this component decorator here. Now input is another decorator in Angular for marking fields and properties as input properties. Now this field is exposed to the outside, and in our templates we can bind it to a property somewhere else. So let's go back in the browser. You can see our star icon is initially full because in app component, I set the isFavorite property of the post object to true. So here in the template, look, we're binding isFavorite to post.isFavorite. So our property binding works perfectly. Now if I click this, it goes empty. Beautiful. Now let me show you the second approach to mark this field as an input property. So back in the favorite component, we don't need this input decorator, so we can delete it from the top. Instead, we can declare this field as an input property in the component metadata. So here in our component decorator, we can add another property, inputs. We set this to an array of strings. In this array, we list all the fields and properties that should be input properties. So in this case, isFavorite. Now you may think this approach is better because there's one less step. We don't have to import the input decorator, and our code is a little bit cleaner. But actually there is a problem with this approach, and I'm going to show you that in a second. Now before going any further, let's make sure the application works up to this point. So save, back in the browser. So our star icon is full, click, it's empty, beautiful. Now what is the problem with this approach? The problem is the use of this magic string here. So this code works as long as we have a field or a property in our class called isFavorite. If tomorrow I decide to rename this field for refactoring reasons, let's say I want to change this to isSelected. So I use F2 to rename this field, and you can see all the occurrences of this field are also updated. However, this magic string here is not updated. So our input property is broken. Let me show you. Save, back in the browser. So look, the star is full, and you may think this is actually working. But no, look what happens when I click on this icon. It doesn't go empty. What's going on? Well, when you declare a field as an input property using the component metadata, this actually creates a field under the hood like this. isFavorite boolean. And of course, in our template, we can bind this to another property. Like here, in app component, we're binding this to another property, right? So in our component, we'll end up with two fields. This isFavorite is a completely separate field, and it's got nothing to do with isSelected. Note that here in onClick method, we have used isSelected field, not isFavorite. That's why when we click this icon, nothing happens. So I personally think this is really redundant. I don't like that Angular team have multiple ways to do things in Angular. It just makes the framework harder to learn and confuses new learners. Plus, you can see the issue with this magic string here. So I hope in the future versions of Angular, they just drop this and make component metadata simpler. So back to the first approach, I'm going to import the input decorator, and let's delete this. Apply @input here. So this is how we define input properties. So in the last lecture, you learned how to define an input property. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to give this input property an alias or a nickname. Here's a use case. In this component, we have defined our isFavorite field using camel casing notation, because that's what we use in JavaScript or in TypeScript. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and the first letter of every word after is uppercase. Now, maybe in your applications, you don't want to use camel casing notation in your HTML markup. So back in our app component, let's say in our property binding, we want to use something like this, is-favorite. Now, in JavaScript or in TypeScript, we cannot have a field with that name. That's not an acceptable identifier. So the solution is to use an alias or a nickname for an input property. So back in our favorite component, here when using the input decorator, we can optionally supply a string to set an alias for this property. So I'm going to use is-favorite. As simple as that. Now back in the browser, our favorite component is initially filled, and when we click it, it toggles. Beautiful. Now using an alias also has another benefit. It keeps the contract of this API stable. Let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to remove this. Let's go back to our app component and revert this back to isFavorite like this. Okay. Now back in the component, let's say tomorrow, for refactoring reasons, we decide to change the name of this field. So we press F2 and change this to isSelected. Now you can see all the occurrences are updated here in onClick. Okay. But our application is now broken because app component is expecting an input property called isFavorite. So when we go to the browser, we see the same error, can't bind to isFavorite. Now to minimize the impact of these changes, we can use an alias to keep the contract of a component stable. So back in our favorite component, I can apply an alias here, isFavorite. Okay. Now this magic string is going to stay here. If I rename this field in the future, our magic string is not going to be impacted. So app component will continue to use this component exactly like before. Let's try it. So we don't have any errors in the browser. And here's our favorite icon. But note that it's initially empty, whereas we expect it to be full. Why? Let's go to the template for our favorite component. So favorite.component.html. Note that here we're still using the isFavorite field. So we renamed this field to isSelected, but we forgot to come back here and make this change. So if I quickly rename this field here to isSelected, now our component is working. What I want to point out here is that yes, when you rename fields, your templates are not updated. So you need to manually make these changes. However, because we use an alias on this input property, we don't have to go and change another 100 places in our code where we have used this component, like in our app component. Also, if you're building a reusable component that we want to distribute, we don't want to tell all our clients, all the consumers of our components that, hey, now this field is renamed from isFavorite to isSelected. So we are minimizing the impact of these changes. We can use rename refactoring in VS Code. So by pressing F2, we can change this field and all the occurrences in our TypeScript code, but then we have to manually go and change the template as well, which is one extra step. Okay. So here's the lesson. If you're building reusable components, give your input properties an alias to keep the contract of your components stable. Next, we're going to look at output properties. Now let's take our favorite component to the next level. So I want to be able to be notified when the user clicks on this favorite component. So I want this component to raise a custom event like change that we can bind to a method in our host component. So in app component, I want to have a method like onFavorite changed. And this method will be called whenever our favorite component raises the change event. So let's go to app.component.ts. Here we want to add that method onFavorite changed. For now, let's just add a simple message in the console. Favorite changed. Now back in the template, we need to extend our favorite component so it raises the change event whenever the user clicks on this component. How do we do that? It's very similar to what we did earlier. So instead of declaring an input property, we want to declare an output property. Let's see. So let's go back to our favorite component. First on the top, I'm going to import the output decorator function from Angular/core. Then I'm going to declare a field here, and the name of this field should be exactly the same name as the event we want to raise, in this case, change. Now we should decorate this field with our output decorator. Now we should also initialize this field to an instance of the event emitter class. Let me show you. So we use the new operator and then event emitter. So because event emitter is not a primitive type in TypeScript or in JavaScript, we need to use the new operator to create an instance of this class. Now you can see we have a compilation error here because we have not imported this class on the top. Now if you're using the auto import plugin, you can press Command and period on Mac or Control and period on Windows. And in this menu, select the last item, add event emitter to existing import declaration from Angular/core. Now, if you're not using this plugin, simply go on the top and import event emitter here. Okay, the compilation error is gone. Now, finally, in our onClick method, after we toggle the isSelected field, we want to raise an event. We use our event emitter for that. So this, the change, that's our event emitter. Now here we have a method called emit, and we use that to raise or publish an event, which basically means notifying others that something has happened. Now let's test this. Save, back in the browser. So I'm going to click this icon. Now look in the console. We got this message, favorite changed. So this is how we raise custom events from our components. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to pass event data when raising an event. So in our app component here in this event handler, on favorite changed, currently we're displaying only a simple message in the console. We don't know anything about this event. We don't know if the user has marked an object as favorite or not. So we need to change our implementation and pass some data when raising this event. So back in our favorite component, here when we are emitting this event, we can optionally pass some value. And this value will be available to all subscribers of this event. In this case, the subscriber of the change event is our app component, because that's where you're handling this event. That's where we're getting notified when the state of the favorite component changes, okay? So back in the favorite component, we can pass an argument to this emit method. In this case, I'm going to pass this dot is selected. That's the new state of this favorite component, okay? So this is a simple Boolean, and in our event handler, we're going to get a simple Boolean value. So save, back in app component, here I'm going to add a parameter. Let's call this is favorite, okay? And then I'm going to simply display this in the console, is favorite. And finally, the last step. Let's go to our app component.html. So here, when we are handling the change event, we want to pass a $event object to our event handler. You have seen this before. When handling the click event of buttons, we use this $event object, which is a built-in object in Angular. Okay, now previously when handling the click event of buttons, this $event represented a standard DOM event object. Here, because we're dealing with a custom component, this $event could be anything that we pass when raising an event. In this case, it's going to be a simple Boolean value. Let's try this. So back in the browser, I'm going to click this icon. Now look in the console. Is favorite is false, okay? Now I'm going to click one more time, and this time is favorite is true. So this is how we pass data along with our events. Now back in the favorite component, here we're dealing with a very simple component. Maybe in your applications, you're building something more complex. So instead of a simple Boolean value, you may want to consider passing an object. So let's change this implementation and instead pass an object. This object can have a property like new value, and we set this to this that is selected. Okay? Now back in the template for app component. Here, our $event object now represents an actual JavaScript object that has a property called new value. And also, in our app component, which is the subscriber of the change event of our favorite component, instead of a simple Boolean value, we're going to receive an actual object. We can call this event args, event arguments, or the arguments passed with the event. And then displayed here. Now let's try this. So back in the browser, I'm going to click this icon. And then in the console, look at the event data. We have an object with a property called new value, which is set to false. Now, one last tip before we finish this lecture. If you're dealing with a complex implementation, perhaps you may want to apply a type annotation here so you get compile time checking as well as IntelliSense in this method. Now, one way to do this is to use inline annotation. So we can say this event args is an object that has a property called new value, which is a Boolean. It's a little bit messy, it's a little bit verbose and noisy. Potentially, we can define an interface somewhere else that defines the type of arguments of this change event. For example, here I can define an interface called favorite changed event args. So this interface represents the shape of the object that is passed along with the change event of our favorite component. In this object, we're going to have new value property, which is a Boolean. And then instead of this inline annotation, we can use favorite changed event args. And with this, we get compile time checking and IntelliSense. That's better. Now, if you're building a reusable component, you want to declare this interface in your implementation and export it from your module. And then any consumers would import this from your module. So instead of declaring this interface here, ideally we should add it here after our components. We're going to export this interface. So export like this. And then in app component, we need to import this type from the other module. So with auto import plugin, I can simply put my cursor here and press command and period and import this type on the top. So this is all about passing event data. So earlier, you learned how we can use an alias to keep the contract of a component stable. Previously, we used an alias on an input property, but we can also use an alias on an output property. So here, if tomorrow I decide to change the name of this event from change to something else, my application is going to break. Let's try this. So I'm going to rename this to click. Now back in app.component.html, you can see this component, which is the client or the consumer of our favorite component, is expecting a change event, but that doesn't exist anymore. Now back in the browser, I'm going to click this. So our component is working, and you may think nothing is broken. But if you look at the console, we no longer have our log messages. So I'm talking about this message that we log in onFavorite changed method of app component. In other words, in app component.html, we're handling the change event, but there's no event by that name. It's because our app component is expecting this event, but it's never happening. So it's assuming maybe sometime in the future, this event is going to get raised. That's why it doesn't give us an error in the browser console. But our code is broken. This event handler is not called. So back in our favorite component, we can apply an alias here to make sure that if in the future we rename this field, the clients of this component are not going to break. So let's call this change, save. Now back in the browser, I'm going to click this. Now look at the console. We get all these messages that are coming from our event handler. So once again, you can use an alias on the input and output properties of your components to keep the API of the component stable. All right, now let's take a closer look at the templates for our components. So far, you have seen two forms of using templates in a component. One way is to store the template externally, and then we use the template URL property of component metadata to specify the path to the template file. Another approach is to use the template property. So we can add the template inline here. Now you cannot mix these two approaches. So you should either use the template URL and store the template externally, or type it inline here. Which approach is better? Well, it really depends. If you're building a small component with a very simple template, you can add the template here, and this makes it easier to port this component and take it to a different application. But if your template is more than 5 lines of code, or perhaps more than 10 lines, you can imagine that this code is going to get too busy, too noisy. In that case, it's better to store the template externally. Now, when you create a component with Angular CLI, as you have seen before, it always puts the template in a separate file. So for each component, we have a folder, and inside that folder, we have the CSS file, the HTML file, the unit test file, and the actual component file. You can argue that even with this approach, you can copy the entire favorite folder into a different project. And that's a perfectly valid argument. So which approach you choose is more of a personal preference. My recommendation is to use templates externally if there are more than 5 lines of code. Now let me show you one more thing about templates before we finish this lecture. So I'm going to delete this line here. Next, I'm going to go to app-component.html. I'm going to add a simple heading here. So hello world, right? Now back in the browser, in Chrome Developer Tools, under the Network tab, look, these are the requests to the server. So if you look in this list, there are no requests to any of our template files. So where are they? Our templates are actually bundled along with our source code. So here we have main.bundle. So all our TypeScript code is compiled or transpiled into JavaScript and is placed inside this bundle. Now let's click this, go to the response tab. So this is the content of our main bundle. If you search for hello world, look, all our external templates are actually bundled along with our JavaScript code. So there are no separate requests to the server to download these templates. As we build components, sometimes we need to apply styles to our components. In Angular, there are 3 ways to apply styles to a component. Let me show you. Before starting, I want to delete some code that we're not going to use. So let's remove this part, implement onInit. We're going to look at this onInit interface in the future. So for now, let's not worry about it. Delete. And then we can also delete this method, ng-onInit, as well as the constructor. Okay, now we have a cleaner code. So there are 3 ways to apply styles to a component. One way is by using this style URLs property in the component metadata. So here we have an array, and in this array, we can have 1 or more CSS files. You might have a master template, you put that first, and then you might have additional skins that you want to apply on top of the master template. Simple as that. Now, the other way is by using the styles property. Styles. Now, similar to style URLs, we set this to an array. And here we often use backtick, so we can break up our styles into multiple lines. And with this approach, we can write our styles inline in this component. And this is exactly like writing templates inline. So if you're working with a small component with only a few styles, you may choose to write your styles here rather than in an external style sheet. Now you might ask, why do we have an array here? Why not just a simple string? Well, honestly, even I don't know the reason for this design. So this is the second way to apply styles. And by the way, Angular doesn't complain if you use both these properties, style URLs and styles, but what comes last will be the one that will be effective. And I'm going to show you that in a second. Now finally, the third way to apply styles is by writing them inline in our HTML template. So we can go to favorite.html and simply use the style tag to apply some styles here. Now, this is obviously not a good practice, but Angular allows you to use this approach if that's what you prefer. Now, back in the component, let's see how these styles overwrite each other. So first, I'm going to go in our external style sheet and apply some style there. So let's go to favorite.css. Here, I'm going to define a rule for an element with the class glyph icon. So glyph icon, and I'm going to set the color to red. Okay. Now I'm going to copy this back in the component, paste it here, but this time I want to change the color to green. Now, when we run the application, our icon is going to be green because we applied this last. Look, it's a green icon. However, if I take this style URLs property and put it at the end, now our icon is going to be red. There you go. Now, what I want you to note here is that Angular is going to pick only one of these style definitions, the one that comes last. In other words, if I define another style here, let's add a rule for a class called glyph icon dash star. Now here I'm going to set background to black. So the star is going to be green and the background is going to be black. And then it's going to apply the styles defined in this external style sheet, which will change the color of the star to red. So you may think we're going to see a red icon on a black background, but that's not the case. Let's verify this. So we have a red star without a black background. This means that Angular is going to completely ignore all the styles we have defined here, and it will only apply the styles we defined in this external style sheet. So you really need to pick one of these approaches. Now finally, if you add any styles in the template, it will always be applied and it will overwrite any previous rules unless previous rules are more specific. And this is just basic CSS. So let's verify this. Back in favorite.component.html, here I'm going to apply glyph icon and change the color to blue. So this will overwrite the color of our star icon. Let's verify this. You can see it's blue. Now, irrespective of which approach you choose, what is interesting about Angular is that it creates a scope for these styles. So these styles will not leak outside of this component's template. So if you have a glyph icon somewhere else in our HTML document, these styles will not be applied to that glyph icon. Now, how that happens, that's the topic for the next lecture. So in the last lecture, I explained that the styles we apply to our components here are scoped to this component. So they will not leak outside the template for this component. But how does that work? Well, before we get there, we need to look at the concept of shadow DOM. If you have never heard of shadow DOM before, it's basically a specification that enables DOM tree and style encapsulation. Simply put, it allows us to apply scoped styles to elements without bleeding out to the outer world. Now, this is kind of a new feature in browsers. Not all browsers out there support this. In fact, as far as I know, it's only supported in Safari 10 and higher, or Chrome 53 or higher. Now, let me show you Shadow DOM in action. Look at this piece of code here. You have seen something like this before, right? So this is plain old JavaScript. We're not talking about Angular. We use document and the query selector method to get a reference to an element in our HTML document. Okay, so we have this element, and then we can use the inner HTML property to set its inner HTML. Now here we have a simple h1 to display hello, and above that we have this style, which changes the color of our heading to red. Now the problem with this implementation is that this style leaks outside this element. So if I have another h1 somewhere else, that's going to be red as well, but I don't want that. Now, if you're building a component and you're going to apply some styles to your component, you want to make sure those styles are only scoped to your component. Or let's say you want to use a component built by someone else. they might have defined some styles on their component. When you bring that component into your application, you don't want those styles to overwrite the styles in your application. So that's where Shadow DOM shines. We can change this code and use Shadow DOM with only one extra line of code. So after we get a reference to this element, we simply call l.create shadow root. And this gives us the root of Shadow DOM for that element. Then instead of using the inner HTML property of the element, we use the inner HTML property of the shadow root. That's all. And with this, our h1 style will be scoped only to this element. It will not leak outside this element. So this is Shadow DOM. Now you might ask, what does this have to do with Angular? Well, back in our favorite component, here we have this concept called view encapsulation. So in the component metadata, we have another property called encapsulation. And we set this to the value of view encapsulation enumeration. So view encapsulation. This is an enum that is defined in Angular core. So look, view encapsulation is defined in Angular/core. Now, this enum has three members: emulated, which is the default value, native, and none. Now, for the most part, you're going to use emulated. You're not going to change this setting. But I'm explaining how this works so you have a better understanding of Angular framework. Now, with this mode, Angular emulates Shadow DOM. So it understands that most browsers out there don't support Shadow DOM, so it has its own trick to apply scope to our styles. Let's see how that works. So back in the browser, here's our red icon. Let's inspect this. Now, in the head section, we have 4 style elements. The first one is bootstrap. You can see that here. The second one includes all the global styles we define in styles.css. So earlier I defined 20 pixel padding on our body element. The third one is an empty style element. Now look at the fourth one. Let me zoom in so you can see more clearly. Looks familiar, right? So here we have our glyph icon class, but Angular has attached an attribute here, ngContent-c1. And inside this rule, we have color set to red. Now, what is this? Well, if you look at what we have in the DOM, so this is our favorite element, which is the host element for our favorite component. This is our span, where we have the glyph icon class. You can see that attribute applied to this element as well, ngContent-c1. So Angular attaches an attribute to our elements and uses that attribute to post-process our CSS rules. And this way, this red color will only be applied to an element that has the glyph icon class as well as this attribute, ngContent-c1. Now, if you look anywhere else in this document, you won't see this attribute. For example, here we have another span, which is for rendering the user icon. But the attribute here is ngContent-c0. Now, you don't ever have to worry about these attributes. They're generated automatically at runtime. We're not going to code against them. They're purely for Angular to do its job. And this is the emulated view encapsulation, which is the default encapsulation mode. So Angular tries to emulate the concept of Shadow DOM. Now, the second value we have here is native. And with this, instead of generating these attributes dynamically, Angular uses the native Shadow DOM in the browser. And of course, this is not going to work in most browsers out there. It's only supported by Chrome version 53 or higher and Safari version 10 or higher. But let's see how this works. So save. Back in the browser. First, you can see our red icon, our red favorite icon disappeared. I will explain why this happened later. So for now, let's just right-click it and inspect it. Now, once again, look at the head section. So we have 3 style tags. The first one is bootstrap. The second one is the global styles. The third one is the empty one. We don't have the fourth style element where we had our post-process CSS rule. Now, if you scroll down, here's our favorite icon. Look, under that, we have this shadow root. If you don't see this, you need to go to the settings of Chrome Developer Tools. Scroll down. Under Elements, make sure to tick show user agent shadow DOM. Okay. Now under shadow root, we have this style element and our glyph icon class is applied here. So it doesn't have that additional attribute. Now, why did our icon disappear? Because the only styles applied to this element is the red color. So none of the styles defined in Bootstrap are applied to this element. And that's why we don't see the actual icon. Now, if you want to really bring Bootstrap stuff here, you need to do something like this. So we go to favorite.component.css. On the top, we're going to import Bootstrap. We can simply go to styles.css and copy this import statement into our favorite.component.css file. Now back in the browser, now we have our red star icon. Let's inspect this. So here's our favorite element. Under that, we have shadow root. Look at this style element. We've got Bootstrap here. So all the styles defined in Bootstrap ended up under this element. And as you can imagine, this is going to create performance problems down the road. So you shouldn't really do what I showed you. I just wanted to explain why our icon disappeared. It was because of the scope that is applied to this element as a result of using shadow DOM. So back here, I'm going to remove this line. Now let's go to our favorite component. So this was native view encapsulation, which uses shadow DOM in the browser. And finally, we have none, which basically means here we're not going to have view encapsulation. So the styles defined here will leak outside this template. In other words, when we go back to the browser, both our icons are going to be red. Let's see. There you go. So obviously, you don't want to use this. So here's the lesson. The default view encapsulation is emulated, which emulates the shadow DOM, and it works by attaching additional attributes to our CSS rules. Now, for 99.9% of the cases, you don't want to change this. I just explained what this is all about. So if you read some documents on the web and you come across the term view encapsulation, you know what's happening under the hood. So don't even bother with this property. Imagine we want to build a Bootstrap panel component. So I've created a new component called panel component. You can see the selector for this component is bootstrap-panel. So here I have used Bootstrap to prefix this selector because we don't want to use panel because chances are this name is going to clash with another component. So as a best practice, if you're building reusable components, always prefix them. So here, bootstrap-panel. Now, let's go to the template for this panel. In order to render a Bootstrap panel, we need a div with two classes. So .panel and .panel-default. So if you press tab here, we get this markup, right? Now, let's undo this. I want to add more markup here. So we generate it in one go. Now, inside this div, we want to have another div with the class panel-heading. And next to this div, we want to have another div with the class panel-body. Now tab, this is our markup. So let's just put some label here, heading and body. Now back in the browser, this is a Bootstrap panel. It's a nice user interface component. Now let's make this dynamic. So I don't want to hard code this heading and body labels here. I want the consumer of this panel component to be able to inject text or markup into this component. So let's go to app-component.html. This is where we have used the Bootstrap panel. Now, in order to set the heading and the body, one way is to use property binding. So we can define input properties like heading and body and set them to the body property of app component. But this syntax is a little bit weird here because I don't want to go in app component, define a property called body, and there add my markup. I want to be able to write my markup right here. So let me show you a better way. Instead of using property binding with input properties, we're going to use the ng content element. So let's go to the template for panel component. So here, we want to add two injection points so the consumer of this panel component can provide content into those injection points. So here inside panel-heading, I'm going to add an element called ng-content. This is a custom element defined in Angular. And similarly, I'm going to add this inside panel-body because I want the consumer of this component to be able to provide content that should be placed here at runtime. Now here we have two ng-content elements. Somehow we need to distinguish them. We need to give them some kind of identifier. So we use the select attribute, select, and set this to a CSS selector. We can reference a class, an ID, or an element. So here I'm going to use a CSS class like dot heading. So if in the consumer of this panel component, we have an element that matches this selector, which means an element with the heading class, that element is going to be placed right here instead of ng-content. In other words, ng-content is going to be replaced with that element. Okay? Now similarly, I'm going to set the select attribute here and set this to dot body. Now let's go back to our app component. Here inside the bootstrap-panel element, I'm going to add two divs, one with the class heading, and next to that, I'm going to add another div with the class body. Okay, now let's set our custom content. So here's the heading, and here's the body. Or we can add complex HTML markup here. So we can have, let's say, an H2, here's the body. Below that, we're going to have a paragraph with some content here. Okay, now let's preview this in the browser. So look, this way we can provide custom content to our reusable components. So if you're building reusable components, like in this case, a bootstrap panel, and you want the consumer of these components to be able to provide custom content, use the ng-content element. Now, following from our last example, let's inspect this heading element. So look, this is our panel-heading element. And inside that, we have this div with the class heading and the actual heading label. So this div you see here is what we put in app component. Let me show you one more time. So here in app component template, inside bootstrap-panel element, we have this div with the class heading. Now we use this class as a selector for the ng-content element in panel component. Let's have a look. So here's panel component, and here we have an ng-content with this selector, dot heading. So with this implementation, when Angular finds an element with this selector, in this case, dot heading, it's going to replace this ng-content with that element. And that element, as you saw in app component, is a div with the class heading. So I'm going to copy this back in panel component. At runtime, this ng-content is going to be replaced entirely with this div. Now this markup worked perfectly fine. We had a beautiful bootstrap panel, but sometimes we don't want this additional div here. It's just extra noise in the markup. It would be nicer to have just this heading here, right? So let me show you how you can achieve this. Now back to this ng-content, okay? Let's go to our app component. So I'm going to replace this div with ng-container. This is another custom element in Angular. So at runtime, Angular is going to take only the content of this ng-container. It's not going to render this ng-container element in the DOM. It's not going to be a div or something else. Let's look at the result. So save, back in the browser. Let's inspect this heading one more time. So here's our panel-heading, which is in our bootstrap panel component. Let's inspect this. And now we can see we have the actual heading without any additional markup around it. So if you want to render something without putting it inside a div or another kind of HTML element, use ng-container element in Angular. All right, once again, it's your turn. I want you to implement a like button like this. You've probably seen this on Twitter. So we have this heart icon, and next to that, we have the number of people who have liked a given tweet. When we click this icon, it turns pink and the number of likes is increased by 1. If we click it again, it turns back to gray and the number of likes is updated accordingly. Also note that when I hover my mouse over the icon, the mouse pointer changes to a hand. So you need to use CSS to change the color of this icon as well as the mouse pointer. Note that the default color is not black, it's gray. For this, I have used CCC. And when it's active, I have used the color deep pink. If you want to implement this kind of mouse pointer, you need to set the cursor attribute to pointer. So go ahead and build a reusable like component. This component should have two input properties. One is the total number of likes, and the other is a Boolean property which indicates if the current user has liked a given tweet or not. So note that in the app component, I have a tweet object with 3 properties: body, is liked, and likes count. And then in app.html, you can see we have this like component, and I have used property binding to set the likes count and is active properties of this component. So go ahead and spend 10 to 15 minutes to do this exercise. Next, you will see my solution. All right, first, let's go in the terminal and generate a new component using Angular CLI. So ng gc like. Beautiful. Now let's go to like.html. So here we want to have a heart icon. For that, I'm going to add a span with 2 classes. One is glyph icon, and the other is glyph icon dash heart. Okay. Now we should also add a class dynamically that would change the color of this icon to pink if the icon is active. So for that, I'm going to use class binding. Class.highlighted, and I want to bind this to is active field of this component. Next, I'm going to handle the click event here and bind this to onClick method. Okay, so here's our icon. Now next to that, we want to have a span where we display the total number of likes. So likes count. Okay, now we need to apply some CSS here. So let's go to like.css. Here we need to apply a couple of styles to the glyph icon class. So I want to change the default color to CCC, which is gray, and the cursor to pointer. Now we also need a custom class here, highlighted. And here we're going to set the color to deep pink. That's all CSS we need here. Now finally, let's go to like.ts. I'm going to simplify the selector to like, or if you're building a reusable component library, we can add a prefix here. But for this exercise, we don't need this. Next, I'm going to simplify this code. We don't need implements on init, so delete. And we don't need the constructor and ng on init method either. Instead, we need a couple of input properties. So input, I'm going to call the first one likes count, which is a number. And as a best practice, I'm going to apply an alias here, likes count. Now the second input property is going to be is active. So is active, which is a Boolean. Now finally, we need the onClick method. First, we need to update the number of likes. So we can set this likes count to if this icon is active. So if this that is active is true, we want to decrease this by 1. So I add plus here and -1 here. Otherwise, we want to increment likes count by 1. You did a similar exercise in the section about TypeScript, okay? So finally, we need to toggle the is active field. So this that is active equals not this that is active. That's all we had to write. It was really easy, wasn't it? So finally, let's go to app.component.ts. Here I'm going to create a tweet object. Set the body to whatever. We don't really need it for this exercise. Now here we need a couple more properties. One is likes count. Let's set this to 10. And is liked, which determines if the current user has liked this tweet. So let's set this to true. And finally, let's go to app.html. Here we add our like component and use property binding to set likes count. We're going to bind this to tweet.likes count. And finally, is active. We're going to bind this to tweet.is liked. So note that here the property names are different, and this is deliberate because I didn't want to have a property here called is liked. It's kind of strange to have like and then is liked here. In the context of the like component, it would make more sense to call this property is active. But this is purely my personal preference. If you prefer a different name, that's totally fine. So let's test the result. So back in the browser, so you can see our icon is initially active and the total number of likes is 10. If I click it, now we have 9 likes and the icon is inactive.